I think what the Sunday scaries are you proportionally feel the Sunday scaries in proportion to how different your life is during the weekend from how it is during the week, so that you actually micro adjust and start to adapt to a new way of living so profoundly that when you conceive of and think of returning to the structure of a week, it actually causes you emotional and psychic pain. I think that's the key to Sunday scaries. If you, like me, work all the way through the weekend because that's the only time you get to work, it's like, well, the week coming up, and it's not as hard as the weekend because the real work's already done. In any case, we can talk about that in seminar on Friday. So today we are going to talk about Goethe's Faust. Part 1, part 2, not very much about part 2 today, which is very, 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 very different from part 1. And I'm looking forward to Friday when we talk about not only the entirety of the first part of Goethe's Faust, but the first 2 acts of part 2. So there's quite a bit of reading for Friday. Shorter reading on Wednesday, but start your reading today so that you can get through it. In any case, prior to jumping into Goethe's Faust, we need to do a very brief conclusion of Don Quixote, no longer in summary or analysis of the text itself, but thinking about its relationship to modernism, and this will help set us up for the conversation on Goethe, and also its relationship to memory or metempsychosis, the second term of this course, as well as the concept of masterpiece. And so maybe I won't say as much as I often wish to say, but I will say as much as ought to be said. Here, let's pull this out. Perfect. All right, first thing about Don Quixote that I think makes it a work of modernism is that it is fractionated into 2 parts, very similar in Goethe's Faust. However, Don Quixote by Cervantes is split into 2 parts, and recall that the second part was made that originally the first part was going to be standalone. It was only because the spurious part was written by a certain Avellaneda, a pseudonym of a writer from Tordesillas, that gave Cervantes the desire to write his far more complicated labyrinthine second part, which in some way connects to the first part, transforms the first part, and perhaps even transforms the genre of the work as a whole. Something about Goethe's Faust, also 2 parts. Also, the genre of the first part, which seems very much like a dramatic tragedy, is very different from the sort of surrealist epic drama of the second part. You will soon see this. The first part has a very coherent narrative that has a lot of, I would say, narrative pace, moves very fast, pulls and draws one into it, whereas the second part, it's very hard to know even what the narrative is. And so this relationship of one part to another, and there being an uneasy equality between them, but also the second part transforming and changing the first part, I think is something modern both about Don Quixote and Goethe's Faust. Self-fashioning and identity. I'm going to talk about this in the context of Don Quixote today. Note that he changes his name multiple times from Quijana to Don Quixote. He thinks about becoming Shepherd Quixotes, and then eventually dies legally named as Alonso Quijano the Good. He is somebody, he self-fashions himself in the same way that Cervantes fashions a new genre of literature through. And this self-fashioning, this creation of a new tradition to stand on its own is a modern, is what I would consider what I would call a modern attribute of modern traditions. They are traditions that are themselves abstracted from other traditions, that are in fact creative of their own traditions. If you think about Don Quixote, there should be something sui generis about it. This is a $20 Latin term for you, 2 words. It means of its own kind, one of a kind, is what this means in extremely literate language. And so all of the texts in this course, to some extent, you shouldn't see them as representations just of Spanish literature or of Protestant literature, German literature, or American literature, or Irish literature. You should see them all as being joined together and being individuals. It's like a group of individuals, right? A contradiction in terms of contradictio in adjecto, I would say, in Latin. And so what joins these works together is that they are masterpieces and that they found their own traditions, which makes them part of a sort of meta tradition. That is the masterpiece tradition, as I see it. In any case, Errors and purpose of reading. We've talked about that in the Desoccupato Lector, the idea of an idle reader, learning not to be educated, one's Bible and commentaries on such, or a philosopher, but reading in order to be entertained, reading fictions in order to be entertained, perhaps not even to be bettered at all, but perhaps even worsened in the same way that we sometimes think about trash TV these days in a judgmental way, right? Sitcoms, do they really make us better, or do they make us feel good for a little while wasting our time? And that's up to you. The other thing I think makes this very modern is that rather than simply using characters that are tropaic or topoi-like types, character types like the medieval literature did, and often cathedral plays did, which would be performed on the steps of cathedrals, is instead of having characters that are clearly allegorical, like angel, man, sin, error, you have an actual fleshed out individual character like Don Quixote, who is himself unique, different, so different from the characters around him, and in fact, surrounded by unique characters like Sanson Carrasco and Sancho, that Cervantes develops a possessiveness as an author for his own character, such a possessiveness that he feels inclined to write a second part in order to steal Don Quixote back from a different author who used his character, and then to kill him so that he would not be used. Again, this level of possessiveness is not an ancient or a modern invention, but rather a modern one. And then, of course, there's a tremendous subversion of class, religion, gender, and politics. We know the Duke and the Duchess, Don Antonio, not always shown as morally upright individuals, but those who sort of have the leisure to live at the expense of others, not at their monetary expense, but in Sancho's case, the expense of his hide, right? He has to endure quite a bit of pain because of the Duke and Duchess. Various lashes, also trees because of him, but also pinches and pricks and slaps as well when it comes to Altisidora. Gender, as we know from the wonderful lecture on Marcella that we received, as well as Chrysosimo, Altisidora, and various other characters. This is a concept with which Don Quixote, by using elements from the pastoral, does quite a bit of interesting things. Like I once said, there's a tremendous connection to Shakespeare's As You Like It. As You Like It's very famous character is Rosalind. Rosalind is the only character who gives an epilogue as a female in Shakespeare's plays. But though you should note that during the Elizabethan age, the only actors were men, and so it was a man dressed as a woman who was dressed as a man giving an epilogue. So you can see the sort of meta theatricality. That's something that somebody of great intelligence can do. Memory or metempsychosis. I'm only going to mention one attribute of this in service of also introducing Goethe's Faust. In the same way that Don Quixote becomes the great Spanish masterpiece that influences all Spanish authors, whether they be in Latin America or Spain or all around the world, so does Goethe's Faust become for the German. Major Spanish authors from the 20th century, from Colombia, Garcia Marquez and his Love in the Time of Cholera, huge influence by Don Quixote and Cervantes. Same in Argentina with Jorge Luis Borges. In fact, he has a work that mentions Don Quixote. It's about a French, it's called like Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. It's like a 19th century French guy who completely rewrites the Quixote word for word. And so the question is he imitating or is he creating? And so it'd be like having a perfect clone of yourself. Are they, I don't know, are they a creation or an imitation? And so very interesting. In any case, also one of the great philosophers of the Spanish-speaking world from Spain himself wrote Meditations on Don Quixote. His name is Ortega Gasset. And so huge influence on the Spanish language and the spread of Spanish literature. Very similar with Goethe's Faust. Oh, and just a couple other last notes. Obviously, we have the word quixotic. You can see that it's mispronounced in our language. We don't see quixotic as we ought to, but we say quixotic. Quixotic means to be sort of naively idealistic. If you thought you were going to write a 200-page paper for this class instead of the 3- or 5-page essays for the mid and the final, and you were like, I'm really going to do this, I'm a little bit quixotic, right? It's a noble goal, but is it very realistic? And that's what quixotic is. And so perhaps you can use that on one of your friends who has who bites off more than they can chew, right? Somebody who bites off more than they can chew, more than they can digest, is someone who is perhaps a little bit quixotic, exceedingly idealistic, unrealistic, and impractical. This work has also been done, Quixote, translated into at least 140 languages. And this number, I think, is just amazing. Over the last 419 years or so, since it was first written, over 100 million and 100 to 500 million copies have been sold. There are about 8 billion people who are alive now. I would have to look into how many people who have ever lived, but I think it's probably somewhere around 20 billion, maybe a little bit less. Even if everybody alive were to be alive at the same time, this text with 100 to 500 million copies sold would have a massive influence. And so I just want you to think about how many people ever have imbibed and digested this work and made it part of their lives. Is there an influence in this work that far transcends the influence of most other works? And does that help to make it part of our cultural memory and help the process of metempsychosis, transmigration of the soul from one place to another, from one person to another? Masterpiece, obviously this work has gone beyond its given cultural content. We're not reading it in Spanish, we're not reading it in Spain. Reading it in English in America 400 years after it was first written. This means that this work has survived, like a sort of immortal vampire, and the Anne Rice, still alive. It also doesn't require an elite knowledge of a foreign language, which, as you know, in America, it's sort of elite knowledge to know a foreign language. How many of you know a second language? A couple of you. How many of you were native speakers of that foreign language? Right. Most people who speak a second language in this country, not from travel. Though some people, yes, absolutely. There just aren't that many. If we were in Bruges, Belgium right now, everybody would speak English, German, Flemish, French, and that's mostly because they don't live in a giant island where everybody speaks the same language as they do. In any case, this work has transcended its time and its space. And we don't even read it as a piece of Spanish literature. We read it as a piece of world literature, and particularly as a masterpiece. And so we don't read it for nationalist reasons. We don't read it because we're like, the Spanish are the greatest people to have existed, and the Spanish language is the greatest language. And that is a nationalist way of reading literature. It would be like, say, Italian fascists reading Dante and thinking that the Italian language and helps to reinforce the Italian state and leads to Italian unity. Would be the same as, say, the Third Reich or Eastern Germany during the Cold War, and how they read Faust as a work of German national identity. This is not how we read these texts. Let's see. Yes, just something I should mention is that another thing that makes this a masterpiece, remember, is that since it doesn't require the elite knowledge of another language, it also doesn't include a sort of the elite ability to read poetry, particularly Renaissance epics. Like Jerusalem Delivered or Orlando Furioso were written in a famous epic rhyme scheme called Ottava Rima, which is an 8 rhyme. And something you may have noticed, especially if you've read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, is that reading extended works of poetry, like Goethe's Faust, which is itself 12,000 lines and numbered, is a lot harder than reading prose. And so for an author to write in prose means that author wants the work to be less or more accessible to readers. More accessible, which means that reader only wants to be read by elites or by as many people as possible. As many people as possible. That's part of what makes this a masterpiece and not a classic. Masterpieces invite readers in to learn from them. They don't exclude readers. They maximize who can understand them. And you might even say that current accessibility services that cost money, like Audible these days and YouTube, are further extensions of the bourgeois values that come with masterpieces. Can you download many texts for free online now? Can you listen to many translated texts in your native tongue on Audible or online now? The accessibility of these texts is, well, there's never been a time in history when they have been more accessible, particularly if you speak the English language, which is basically the lingua franca, definitely of scholarship these days, but largely of international politics, culture, which means music, movies, and is all around. So very useful language to know. Adaptations continue to be made. I didn't follow my homework by watching this this weekend. Did any of you watch The Man Who Killed Don Quixote this weekend? It's 2 hours, 13 minutes. At least it's not 3 hours long, but it's got some famous characters in it, including Adam Driver, Kylo Ren, guy from Girls, former Marine, interesting guy. All right. And then I should also mention that something else that makes this a masterpiece, besides the conditions that I laid out before, is its quality. Quality beyond the norm. The tangibles, the languages that this has been translated into, the copies sold, the range of adaptation, the modern relevance, the quality of the storytelling, and the complex interweaving of multiple plots. That's something that's extraordinarily difficult to do and even to read, as you will have noticed. The inventiveness of the concept of the text, the protagonist and his name, and his manner of interaction in literary space. A crazy old character who takes on a new identity that possibly never even exists in the world, which we know never existed in the world because it existed in books, and to himself exist in a book space which is treated like a realist space. And for him to eventually be convinced that he doesn't exist in a book, but in reality, and to have that destroy his idealism so much that he died in a book thinking it's reality. There are very few works of literature you could say that about, and then, or rather, there are very few other works of literature you would think I was mentioning than Don Quixote by having received that description, I think. All right, and then just the dynamic relationship between the first and the second. Second part is used to criticize the false second part by Goethe. It addresses the mistakes of the first part, like it edits and re-edits. It uses the first part to develop the plot and action of the second part. Although the Duke and the Duchess had read the first part, and that informed how they acted and moved the plot forward in the second part. And then, of course, and I must mention this is the final note of Don Quixote before moving on to Goethe's, about the humanity of the characters and the growth of their relationship. Sancho and Don Quixote, by the end of the text, are very much like the best friends you may have heard that they were at the very beginning, and were hoping or wondering whether they would ever get to that level. They do. Their relationship grows. As the text develops, as the writer of the text, the author develops, so do these characters develop. And so do they show not only the development of literature, but the development of life, and how literature can reflect the development that exists in life as well. Also, it's extraordinarily witty and full of humor. So, any of you think it was really funny, Don Quixote? You did? You actually had some people laugh out loud. Can you remember any of the moments you actually were like, that's actually pretty funny, especially for a classic?
The one part at the beginning was making his helmet piece, and the first time he knocks himself in the head and it fell off, and so he goes through all of this to edit it, and then he decides to just not test it again because he doesn't want to break it again.
I love that. Isn't that very human? It's like, so he tests his helmet and the front of it falls off, and then he kind of like puts it back on, and it's like, good enough. If I test it again, it'll probably fall off. So we're just gonna say that's good. Isn't that kind of how you write essays, right? You read it, you reread it, and you're like, do I need to make any changes? I don't know, but I just turn it in, right? How many of you don't, right? And Don Quixote. Another funny part?
When they're all fighting in the dark in the end.
When they're all fighting in the dark in the end. I mean, doesn't that make you think of world politics right now, or perhaps in all times? We're all fighting together at the end. Okay, so there are a couple funny parts at least. I think it is always funny with, you know our definition of a classic is a book that everybody knows but nobody reads. I think classic is also a text that people are always surprised when it's interesting and fun. Because you think a classic must be boring because it's part of the tradition. And yet, we're thinking about tradition correctly. We should know that these texts only exist as part of a tradition which is full of books that create their own tradition. So each of these books should be like its own heavyweight fight. It should be like, I don't know, this is sort of a vernacular example, but there's an anime that I once watched. Yes, any of you anime watchers? It was called Bleach. And the bad guys in one of the arcs are called the Espada, swords, Spanish. And something interesting about them is that the more powerful they become, the more unique and individuated they become, the less common they become. They become more different from each other than even the lower class. And so I see very much masterpieces like the Espada from Bleach. I see them as totally unique from each other, but being connected in that they are part of the same class of thing, that they are of the same quality, although all all of the tangibles about them could be very different, written in different languages, different times, different religions of the authors, different economic classes. None of these are most important to what makes a masterpiece a masterpiece. All right, let's talk transitioning about Goethe's Faust for about 12 minutes before I give over time to our wonderful presentation today. This work was written over 6 decades. Now, I made a big deal about how Cervantes' Don Quixote is in 2 parts. One was written in 1605, one was written in 1650. This work is started, and I apologize for the error right there, in 1773. He doesn't, in fact, go back in time, and ended in 1832. That's 6 decades. It took Goethe more time to write this book than many people during his life lived. And in fact, he lived during a very war-torn time. If you're very much a student of the so-called long 19th century, 1792 to 1914, start of the French Revolution to the start of World War I, that's what's called the long 19th century, then you know there was a lot of war. And in particular, there was the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the eventual restoration of the French court in the 1830s. I should say, honorable mentions, we could have read Swift's Gulliver's Travels, which is extremely witty, or Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, but they're both works of English in English, and we have a work written in English by an Irishman coming later, which is James Joyce's Ulysses. Funny note is that I was listening to a scholar mentioning that Goethe's Faust is perhaps the most complicated work of literature in the modern tradition, except for James Joyce's Ulysses. So you will get to measure them both against each other, and I have no doubt which one you will say is the more complicated one, but I'm looking forward to hearing you say it. So one note about this, though. The second part of Goethe's Faust is more different from the first part than Don Quixote's second part is from the first. Much, much, much more different. Even though you might say that Don Quixote's second part is a little bit more cerebral, metafictional, maybe even purposeful and integrating than the first part. The first part might be more random, for example. The second part of Goethe's Faust, it goes from being a sort of dramatic play with scenes, which is called a tragedy, to a 5-act operatic surreal epic. As in, like, processions of things will start to just happen, particularly during classical Walpurgis night. And so really enjoy the first part. It moves fast. It is decipherable. The second part is where the what is it we say? The feces hits the fan, the shoe, where the shoe drops, where the pedal meets the metal. These are all metaphors for reality. When we come crashing down to reality. Yes?
Was Faust written to be performed at all?
Great question. Was Faust written to be performed? It is written as a play. What is its genre? This is something you could write, because it is technically written as a play with 3 prologues, and there are scenes in the first part, and there are acts and scenes in the second part. However, it is 12,000 lines long. That's pretty close to the length of the Aeneid. That's like a 12 to 15-hour long performance. And so one thing interesting about this is the form of your question. Was this ever meant to be performed? Yes. But what was to be performed? Only ever parts of Goethe's Faust have been performed. So actually a lot of people, sort of like Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, a lot of people think it's just a performance and don't know that the book is behind it. But a lot of people don't actually know the story of the book because they've only seen partialized adaptations represented in front of them. And so it would be impossible, I'm going to say with an asterisk, to actually perform this in one sitting in front of people. And yet, it was written in this way, and it was written in the form of a play. So what is the genre of this text? Is it a really, really long dramatic tragedy? Is it a strange epic written in verse? These are questions that you can ask because it has the form of something performed live, and yet it tends to be read by individuals. In the same way that Shakespeare is often read, but he can be performed in a way that this can't. Excellent. Excellent question. Just a few things to note about the changes from the late 18th century. So now we've been in the 17th century and the late 18th century and the early 19th century. The modern nation state of Germany was founded in 1871. That means there was no Germany when this text was first written. There was the Holy Roman Empire. And you may have heard the quote before that the Holy Roman Empire is the greatest misnomer in history. It was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I think it was in fact an empire. Perhaps it wasn't Roman, it was German, but it was based on Roman institutions. And holy, I don't know, you can call yourself holy. There's really nothing keeping you from calling yourself holy in this world. Even if there is nothing holy. So the Holy Roman Empire, which was around at least from the times of Dante and well before him, only collapsed during the early 19th century, became a loose confederation of states, which would later become the modern nation state of Germany. The French Revolution happened during this time, started in 1792, the rise of Napoleon, and in fact, the fall of Napoleon. If you read War and Peace, it is all about this. This is one of the reasons the war is considered one of the great novels. Not only is it great in terms of length and width, for that matter, but it covers one of the greatest wars and events of all history, so far as we've had it. So it shows also the violent origins of democracy. Note that the American Revolution, 1776, had occurred just after the beginning of the writing of this text, as well as the French Revolution. Very violent affairs, and that war perforates the play. Valentine, the brother of Gretchen Marguerite, she goes by both names. It's confusing, but she goes by both names. And there doesn't seem to be any secret connection between them. Perhaps you could find one, but I don't know any scholars that have, which doesn't mean you couldn't. But her brother Valentine is a warrior. You hear about soldiers in the city. You'll see far more evidence of war and imperialism in the second part, as Faust goes from sort of pursuing his carnal lust, as he does throughout most of the first part, to pursuing other material pleasures like land ownership and conquest. Interesting sort of equal sign between those things. There's subversion of religion. So very odd that a modern work would be so seemingly medieval with a pact with the devil in a prologue in heaven. Doesn't sound very modern unless it's subverting religion. And the pact with the devil is in fact to pursue sin as much as possible. And if sin does not give Faust 2 moments of joy, if it does not give him a moment that he would sacrifice for all other moments, then the pact will be null and void. So this is a strange pact. He, with the devil, is going to pursue all things in this world, to derive joy from them, but in order to realize that nothing gives perennial joy in this world. And this is, I think, a very modern topos. The idea that love is temporary and fleeting and ephemeral, and that money, temporary and fleeting and ephemeral, and knowledge, temporary and fleeting and ephemeral, and power. But there is nothing that there is no value which truly lasts. And this partially reflects the modern ethos of the time, with the passing of religion from its cultural supremacy, particularly Catholicism and Protestantism, the coming of this new empirically based science, and with these profound new tools of knowledge. We have these alchemists, these astrologers, these physicians, and even though they're still sort of quacks at this time and coming up with strange ideas, and sometimes are even still called magicians. In fact, Dr. Faustus, there was a story based, originally the story is based on a character who was himself an alchemist, magician, and physician, who was kicked out of many different cities. With religion losing its cultural superiority, particularly the Christian religion, as a value-creating source, and these empowered scientific individuals being able to master philosophy, theology, law, and medicine, the problem with that is it leaves a big question mark about what is the purpose of living? What is the reason to be alive? Sure, you can learn everything about the law. Sure, you can learn everything about sort of philosophy, but Faust's position is that he has. But the one question he's left with is the most profound question, the hardest question to answer, the only question that modernism, that modern science cannot answer, which is, what's the point of being? And what's the best type of life? And this is a question that, in fact, people change his life. People go from being a scholar that has mastered all learning to being sort of like a college student and just pursuing a local girl, to then becoming a crazy, possessive real estate magnate, sort of. And so this text really parses the modern question of why do we live? And what is the reason for living? And it shows, I think the relationship between gaining great power over the world, but then also not knowing one's place in the world. I think there is an inverted relationship between the greater one's power over the world, the less one understands perhaps where one stands in the world and one's purpose. Perhaps it creates a sense of solipsism. Well, I think that is a good introduction. Next time we'll talk about the Faust legend, which I have quite a bit to say about from the 16th century on until the 19th century. The history of the writing of Faust, which was done in 4 different parts. We'll talk a little bit about how it's modernist and not medieval, though on Wednesday I'd be very interested in you coming and debating that. This is a medieval text, it's not a modern text. And if you'd like to hold that position, come tell me, because maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And then we'll talk a little bit about how it can be a work of world literature or a nationalist piece, or whether it's a masterpiece. Well, what is it? And, well, oh yes, and then I will tell you a little bit about what I should have told you today, but I'm not going to have time to. Mephistopheles is his name. Why isn't he called the devil? Why isn't he called Satan? Why isn't he called Lucifer? I'll explain all those names and their meanings to you and which languages they come from, and also Mephistopheles and leading theories on what his name means. But not until next time.